Good afternoon. We're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Courtney Neubauer, and this training is going to be somewhat of a repeat from the last supply chain fund training we did. I have made some changes to it just because now we have received all of the attestations and we're a little bit further along in the process. So this training is on the supply chain assistance funds. We're going to go over just general information, allowable and unallowable products, the allocation and attestation information, oversight reporting and record keeping, financial management, and some other helpful information. So to start, some general background information about the supply chain funds. USDA has allocated $1 billion in relief funding to state agencies made available through the Commodity Credit Corporation and authorized under the CCC Charter Act. And these resources are referred to as the Supply Chain Assistance Funds. The Supply Chain Assistance Funds are targeted to provide a rapid and direct response via supplied commodities to affected school districts. So on December 17th, USDA announced that $1 billion was going to be provided to states for cash payments, and that school districts could use those payments to purchase foods for their school meal programs. And these funds were intended to be a form of direct relief from the ongoing supply chain issues and to improve the quality and consistency of school meals. So Louisiana received $16,965,978 in supply chain assistance funds, and those were to be distributed to our National School Lunch Program participating schools. This includes our public schools, tribal schools, charter schools, nonprofit private schools, as well as our residential childcare institutions that operate the National School Lunch Program. The supply chain assistance funds are a critical funding stream, and it is meant to provide additional financial resources to help schools purchase domestic food products that are part of the school district's effort to respond to the supply chain disruptions. We know that as a result of COVID-19, we are now seeing a large number of supply chain disruptions. We are seeing increased costs on products. A lot of times you're going outside of your bid to purchase products just to get nutritious meals on the table for students. So the goal of these funds is to help hopefully lighten the blow of the financial difficulties that are coming with purchasing these products. Upon receipt of the funds, state agencies were to distribute the money using a formula that was described by USDA. So USDA did make it clear that it's not all SFAs. They have to be operating the National School Lunch or School Breakfast Program to receive the funds. So if you're not operating the child nutrition programs, then those schools are not eligible to receive assistance. But the eligibility for the funds is not distinguished by school type. So our residential childcare institutions, as well as charter schools, parochial schools, private schools, and our public schools are all eligible as long as they are operating the National School Lunch and/or School Breakfast programs. These funds are meant to solely support the National School Lunch and/or School Breakfast Program and can only be used by SFAs to purchase unprocessed or minimally processed domestic food products for those particular programs. Within the National School Lunch Program, we also have the Seamless Summer Option and the National School Lunch Afterschool Snack Program. And since those two programs are components of the National School Lunch Program, these funds can be used to support those operations. But if an SFA is operating other child nutrition programs, so whether that be the fresh fruit and vegetable program, the summer food service program, or the child and adult care food program, the funds cannot be used in conjunction with those programs. The funds are limited to the purchase of domestic food products to support National School Lunch and the school breakfast program. I've had a lot of questions about allowable and unallowable products. So we'll spend some time talking about what can be, these funds can be spent on and some items that they cannot be used to purchase. So some examples of allowable products. So the products to start must be domestic food products. So they have to be unprocessed or minimally processed, and they have to be domestic. Some allowable food products include fluid milk and other dairy foods like cheese and yogurt, also fruits and vegetables, whether that be, that can also include 100% fruit juices as long as they are fully domestic, grain products like pastas and rice, meats, so whether that be whole meat pieces or food items such as ground meat, those are all considered to be minimally processed, and also meat alternatives like beans and legumes. The variety of processing states that can be used, it can be whole, cut, pureed, can be fresh, frozen, canned, dried. So all of those are allowable and considered minimally processed. We've often got the question about whether or not flavored milks and flavored yogurts are considered to be minimally processed. And yes, these products are eligible for purchase with these funds and are considered minimally processed items. So flavored milk, whether it be strawberry or chocolate, flavored yogurts, those are all considered to be minimally processed and can be used with these funds, in addition to the traditional white unflavored milk. The Buy American requirements. So we know that traditionally in our programs that we are to purchase products that are domestic to the maximum extent practicable. What we are also allowed to do is there are limited exceptions. So sometimes we cannot get products that are fully domestic, and we may be purchasing products that are non-domestic due to price or availability. And with these funds, with the supply chain assistance funds, those exceptions are not available. So the funds can only be used to purchase food products that are domestic. Also, we are to follow our traditional procurement methods. And right now, with the pandemic, we are able to utilize emergency non-competitive procurements. And so you can also do that with these funds. So some of the foods that are not permitted, and that really is around if it's not minimally processed or unprocessed, and whether or not it's actually domestic. So items that are not domestic cannot be used to you cannot purchase with these funds. Additionally, items that are significantly processed cannot be purchased. So some of the examples that have been used are like frozen pizza. So if you were to buy a fully prepared pre-made pizza that it comprises of ingredients that would all be allowable individually, that pre-made pizza is not allowable because it is significantly processed or prepared. So you could use the funds to purchase crushed tomatoes, shredded cheese, whole wheat flour, and sliced vegetables, and you could use all those items to make a pizza yourself, but you could not purchase pre-made pizza with those funds. Other examples of unallowable products include baked goods, and this includes breads, muffins, crackers. Also, you cannot purchase pre-made sandwiches or other meals, and it cannot be used for other prepared or pre-cooked items such as chicken nuggets that come ready to eat or that require no further preparation beyond just heating. The funds are to be used solely for the purchase of foods. They can be unprocessed and minimally processed domestic food products, but you cannot use the funds to allocate for labor, supplies, or other administrative expenses. So these funds are solely to be used for the purchase of foods. If there are non-food costs that are essential to the procurement of these products, then those costs can be allowable with these funds. So if there are incidental costs, such as those related to shipping and handling or packaging that are part of the normal purchase price, then those fees would be allowable in this case with this funding source as well. There is not a requirement to purchase local. So although we are hearing from many SFAs that they are using these funds to purchase locally grown, raised, or caught foods, but that is not a requirement. So the requirement is that they are domestic, so they are grown or produced in the United States, and they do not have to be local to this particular area, but it could they can be used for that. And so we do encourage you to procure local foods if possible. And you can make purchases from local producers. And it's an excellent option for addressing the unexpected supply chain disruptions that we are seeing. The allocation and attestation information. So not all SFAs are required to accept the fund. So what we did is we put out the initial allocation. We let SFAs know what they were going to be allocated based on the formula. And then from there, they could determine if they were going to accept the funds or if they wanted to decline them. At this point, we have received all of the funds back. And so we were able to make some changes to the allocation, which we'll discuss a little bit later. But you will see a revised allocation list coming out very soon. I would say the majority of the questions we're receiving right now are around utilizing these funds with SFAs that use a food service management company or a vendor to prepare the meals. So SFAs that utilize a food service management company or a vendor are eligible for these funds, but they must follow the same guidance as our self-prep operations. So if purchases are made by the FSMC, those should be credited back on invoices, or if the SFA is purchasing particularly minimally processed items, there needs to be some kind of communication between the FSMC and the SFA about which items are domestic that those funds can be used toward. Also, SFAs retain the ability to purchase allowable food items that are outside of their contract, as long as the contract permits that. These funds, we have gone to USDA and made sure, but these funds are provided to the SFA. So the SFA should be receiving the benefits of this funding source, and it should not be passed on to the FSMC, but the FSMC should help to make sure that they're spending those funds appropriately. So if an SFA is utilizing a food service management company, similar documentation would be needed. So the funds can be used toward payment of specific invoices that may be associated with those agreements. It is incumbent on the SFA to ensure that payments over the period in which the award is used are used only for minimally processed domestic food products. The SFAs will need to work with their FSMC to ensure that appropriate expenditures are made and documented for foods that are meeting that requirement. And documentation should include invoices for minimally processed domestic food purchases in support of the contract that are equal or to the value of the funds received. Attestation requirements. So we at the state agency were required to develop an attestation statement for SFAs to complete if they wanted to receive the funding. The attestation was intended to ensure that the SFA was experiencing a supply chain disruption and/or financial difficulties that were related to the supply chain issues, that they would use the supply chain funds only for the purchase of unprocessed or minimally processed domestic food products, and they would continue to observe all existing program requirements regarding record keeping and accountability in connection with the use of those funds. To date, we have received all of the attestation forms or declination forms from SFAs. So we are ready to start making payments. So we are, as a state agency, encouraged to begin issuing funds as soon as practicable. We do hope that funds will begin to be paid in the next 2 weeks. And as a state agency, our deadline for obligation is September 30th, 2023. And that deadline of September 30th, 2023 is specific to our deadline at the state to obligate the funds to the SFAs. As it stands right now, with this allocation that we will be beginning in the next 2 weeks, we intend to fully allocate all of the $16 million. So we will fully be able to meet this deadline of September 30th, 2023. Allocations to individual school districts were based on a predetermined formula. So there were two components. The first component was a base payment of $5,000 to all schools that operate the National School Breakfast Program that were operating as of October of 2021. And then a proportion of that, of the remaining fund, was based on the percentage of enrollment that SFA has compared to the statewide student enrollment. So the base payment of the $5,000 was to ensure that even the smallest districts did receive meaningful level of funding. And then the proportional amount was intended to provide resources that were in scale with the size of the student population served by the SFA. So we used the most recent data that was available, so reflective of October 2021, as described by USDA, to calculate the funding to provide to those individual schools. So to determine the calculation, we first started with our entire $16 million, and we allocated $5,000 to each SFA. We then looked at the enrollment of each SFA from their October claim, and we compared that to the total enrollment of all of our national school lunch operating schools to determine the percentage of that statewide attendance that particular SFA held. From there, we multiplied that times the remaining balance after we awarded the $5,000 to each SFA, and that gave the additional amount of funding that would be provided. We then added up that $5,000 plus that additional payment to get the total payment that was going to be made to the SFA. With the allocation that we completed, we did recently have about $12,000 that was not originally that was not going to be used. So we re-awarded that $12,000 across all of the SFAs that had already completed the attestation that they were wanting to receive the funds. The change in the allocation was fairly minimal. So some of our smallest SFAs had a change of roughly about $2, and some of our biggest SFAs had a change of roughly $500. So in the grand scheme of things, really small compared to the overall total of money in that initial allocation. So currently, that revised allocation is being confirmed by Appropriation Control. And as soon as we get the okay, we will post that and also send out an email to all of the authorized reps, letting you know of the revised allocation that will be slightly increased from that first amount. But like I said, very, very minimal changes for most. Oversight, reporting, and record keeping. So there is a requirement that SFAs maintain records to support the purchases made with these funds. And those funds, those records need to be very similar to what we would review during a normal audit, so during a regular AR. So we will review the use of these funds with the rest of review of the nonprofit school food service account. So oversight, we will do that the same way we do with all other funds. So it will be conducted by both USDA and state agencies in our same way. So we will look at the SCA funds when we look at the rest of the funds and that are used with the nonprofit school food service account. The execution of these oversight measures, as well as the retention of the purchase records, ensures accountability and that appropriate use of the funds consistent with the requirements of the CCC. SFAs are required to maintain documentation to support the food purchases with these funds. So the funds are to be used for the unprocessed or minimally processed domestic food products, and they're equal in amount to the received, and it's consistent with the regular program requirements. So all records must be maintained by the SFA. This includes invoices, receipts, and other documentation provided when the SFA executes purchases with these funds. We also know that invoices or receipts don't always include domestic origin. So just as you would with similar measures to meet the Buy American provision, you may need to have other supporting documentation to support the purchase of products to guarantee that they are of domestic origin. So these would be similar information as to the country of origin as you would for other meat products or fruits and vegetables. So what we're seeing is that a lot of our SFAs are choosing to solely dedicate these funds to the purchase of milk. And that is because milk is domestic. The invoices are usually fairly clean. They do sometimes include other items like maybe juices, and the juices may or may not be fully domestic, but overall, it's a little bit cleaner of an invoice compared to a dry good invoice or a produce invoice that may have a lot of different items that are domestic and non-domestic. You are not required to proactively provide documentation to us, so you don't have to send all that ahead of time. It just needs to be available when we are reviewing as part of our normal review processes. So this is a question that came up in a question and answer session with USDA. So whether SFAs that already had a net cash resource balance that is over the 3-month operating expense, whether or not those school systems are eligible to receive these funds. And the short answer is yes, they are. So there is a requirement that SFAs maintain no more than a 3-month operating balance in their nonprofit school food service account, but that does not impact their eligibility for or receipt of these funds. So we will continue to provide appropriate technical assistance to help SFAs who are exceeding that 3-month operating expense, make sure that they are fully using their federal funds. But we know as we see the cost of products increase, some of these balances are slowly decreasing. So we are fully aware that as we move through this pandemic and the aftermath of the pandemic, that funds are needed by SFAs. So they are not limited to those that do not have excess funds in their accounts already. The spreadsheet may be a little hard to see, but this is a spreadsheet that Babette created to help some of our smaller SFAs keep track of invoices as they spend down their SCA dollars. So it's just a very simple spreadsheet with the date, invoice number, vendor. This one is kind of originally specific to milk, although there's other line items that can be included. And then as the cost is entered in the far right column, it will start decreasing those total SCA dollars until you're getting down to zero. So just a sample of a way to keep track of these invoices to ensure that you're spending down those particular dollars for the domestic minimally processed or unprocessed products. Financial management. So the funds are going to be deposited into the school food service, the nonprofit food service account. So this is the same account that your regular reimbursements are going into right now. Once the funds are deposited, you don't have to track them separately as other money from other monies within that account. So from an accounting standpoint, the funds don't need to be tracked separately. So maintaining a spreadsheet, as I showed you a little while ago, is a great way to track those monies since they're not going to be separated within the account. The funds cannot be used to purchase for retroactive expenditures. So it cannot be used for past expenditures. It can only be used for current or future expenses. So this includes new obligations or bills on prior unpaid obligations that come due following the receipt of funds. So if an SFA signs a purchasing contract for milk before the start of the school year, and that is paid on a monthly basis, if you receive your funds on March 1st, then you can pay any invoices for milk that are due on or after March 1st. So once you receive those funds, you can start making payments to invoices from that date forward. So there's been some confusion about the deadline for SFAs to expend funds. So as I mentioned earlier, there is a September of 2023 deadline for state agencies, but there is not a deadline for SFAs to expend the funds on a local level. So we do encourage that SFAs expend those funds timely, since there is that additional tracking requirement with those funds. But if it takes you till the end of next school year to expend all those funds, that's absolutely okay. So whatever is easy for you. So if you want to spend it quicker and use more products that may require additional tracking as to country of origin to use up those funds quickly, that's absolutely okay. But at the same time, if you would prefer to use it for just milk invoices and it takes you much longer, that's okay as well. So there is no deadline to expend those funds as long as you're keeping track of the tracking requirement that is needed. Other helpful information. So key dates. As a reminder, our date that we're recommending to pay is in March. So we are still in March and I'm feeling like we're going to make payments in March. So like I said, the next 2 weeks is ideal. I did get confirmation while we're on this call that the updated spreadsheet has been confirmed by Appropriation Control. So I would expect this afternoon or tomorrow morning that that updated allocation will be made available. The recommended date by which our allocation process should begin is September 30th, 2022, and then the entire performance due date is September 30th, 2023. At this time, we do not anticipate that we will have any funds to reallocate. So in this allocation that we are making in March, we are planning to expend all of the funds to SFAs and should not have any monies left over for a second allocation. The CFDA number and revenue code. So the CFDA number for these funds is 10.555, which is the exact CFDA number as the National School Lunch Program. So there's no difference in the CFDA number for the Supply Chain Assistance Funds from your traditional National School Lunch, School Breakfast Program funds. The revenue code, so I have reached out to our friends in the financial audit section, and they have confirmed that the revenue code is going to be 4515. We are going to work to make a line on the income and expense to allow you to report these funds. So 4515 is the traditional line item on the income and expense where you're reporting your reimbursements, which usually matches the claim section of our website exactly. So to not complicate things too much, we intend to have a separate line item where we can keep track of the supply chain funds as well. So just to help keep it fairly simple, it will be 4515, but on the income and expense as you're planning ahead for the school year and filling out those forms in June and July, then we just want to make sure that you are aware of what that requires when we start filling those forms out in July. So when you get to July and you're panicking about your income and expense statement, we are already ahead of you. We're thinking about it. We'll have to come up with a plan, but it will be, we will have a place for you to report that come that time. So we have a few memos that are out. So memo SFS 22-54 was the first memo. In that memo, there are additional memos that are linked to it. So the questions and answers from USDA and the initial memo regarding these funds are included in that one memo. Memo SFS 22-83 contained the original allocations, and then the revised allocation memo should be coming very soon. So as I mentioned, I expect that it will probably be this afternoon or tomorrow morning. It is just slightly different. So I kind of looked at some of the smallest SFAs and the difference is roughly $2, and some of the biggest SFAs roughly about $500. So not a huge difference from those initial allocations, but just so you are aware, there will be a new memo coming out with those revised allocations. If you have any questions, please, to start, put those in the chat box, and I would be happy to answer that. If you have any questions after this training, you can contact us at childnutritionprograms@la.gov. You can also call us at 225-342-9661. So there is one question that has already come through about whether or not SFAs are allowed to charge an additional fee above the current per meal price on invoices. So would it be allowable for there to be additional line item with an additional fee, or are SFAs or are FSMCs still only allowed to charge a per meal price? So the answer is there cannot be an additional fee that is passed on to the SFA. So the per meal price that was agreed upon as part of the contract is what is still going to be on the invoice. What we are expecting is that in that per meal cost, so if you have a number of meals that are that you're paying a certain fee for, a portion of that per meal cost is going toward the purchase of milk. And so if they're able to kind of distinguish how much of that is milk and have those attached invoices, you can basically spend down those supply chain funds for a portion of that per meal cost that is directly used to support the purchase that the FSMC is making for milk or other items that are meet the requirement for the SCA funds. There's a question about whether or not these funds need to be placed in a separate account. They do not. So these funds, the SCA funds, will be deposited into the nonprofit school food service account. And from an accounting standpoint, they do not need to be tracked separately from the regular reimbursement that's being deposited into that account. The difference is there will be a tracking requirement that can be done outside of accounting to make sure that those funds are used for the purpose that they are intended for. So a spreadsheet with the attached invoices to support that, those funds were used for domestic products, but they do not have to be tracked separately from an accounting standpoint. Any other questions? No more questions. They're not coming in yet. As soon as I'm able to get the memo number or the comment that will be listed in LeGov, I will make sure that that is made available. So right now, our appropriation team is working with the budget team to get that set up in LeGov so that the payments can be processed. And so once that code or that memo is told to us, we will make sure that that is also communicated out. And then working that we can get those payments processed as quickly as possible. But be looking for that additional spreadsheet with the revised allocations, which will come in the form of a memo very, very soon. If there are no more questions, that is all I have for today. Please join us for some of our additional trainings that are coming in the next few weeks. We've got one on the traditional standards next week, and we have one on CEP in 2 weeks. Thank you for joining us today. If you have any questions, please call or email. We'd be happy to help.